Well, it's finally time to do some serious work on my 73 Opel Manta. I need to decapitate it.
In other words, this is a video all about the cylinder head on my 1.9 liter Opel engine. It's been leaking around the outside for a while, making a mess, so I'm going to remove the head to replace the head gasket. But also, I think I need new valve seals because every time I start the car hot, there's a big puff of smoke. Along the way, I'm going to discover lots of weird inconsistencies and differences between the early and late heads. It's a bit of a long video, but we're going to learn a lot along the way, and hopefully it'll all turn out well.
It's a little outside my comfort zone to take an engine apart and get into the internals and potentially mess up critical components, but I've been doing my research and I'm pretty sure I can handle this. I guess we better get into it.
As any good project starts, I'll disconnect the battery and just start taking off all the surrounding accoutrements that are in the way, starting with the intake and exhaust manifolds. You can see that the oil leaks haven't done any favors to the paint on the block, which I only redid about 5 years ago. But for now, let's drain the coolant and get the radiator out. Well, this doesn't look very good. I must have temporarily filled up the system with water, thinking I would later replace it with coolant, and forgot. It looks like there's just brown rusty water in here, so I'm gonna have to flush out the whole engine block and heater core and radiator. With that in mind, off comes the thermostat so I can shove a garden hose down there and flush all the rusty chunks out of the block. And this is why it's important to use the correct coolant. It has corrosion inhibitors in it that prevent this rust from happening. I think I got lazy because I live in a nice climate where it doesn't freeze. Learn from my mistakes. Anyway, off comes the thermostat housing, and I couldn't help but do a bit of degreasing around the engine. I am going to keep going with this later and actually repaint the engine block, but that's when it all goes back together. For now, I just want to make it a bit nicer to work on. After doing some cleaning, it's easier to see what the main issue was with this head gasket. This front cork area over the timing cover is blown out. It also reveals a bit of a mismatch. These cars, depending on when they were built, could come with a 10-bolt head or a 12-bolt head. And what I have going on here is I have a 10-bolt head, but a 12-bolt timing cover, if you see these two extra holes at the front. This isn't necessarily a problem, but what is a problem is that I have a 10-bolt head gasket on here, which doesn't match up nicely to the 12-bolt timing cover. So the new head gasket I'll be putting on is a 12-bolt head gasket.
Okay, it's a couple days later. I've done a couple more things off camera. I took the fan off, took the spark plugs out, did a little bit more cleaning in the frontal area, but we're pretty much ready to start taking this head off. What I need to do is verify the timing marks, and in order to pull the head off, you need it to be on number 4 cylinder, top dead center, because the cam actually has some grooves in it that allow access to the head bolts. But before that, I'm going to bring it around to number 1 top dead center and just sort of verify timing marks, and then we can get this head off.
To start with, I'm going to take off the cam covers. There's one in the back and one in the front. These will be where I lift the head off from.
So in the back of the block, there's this little window that looks through to the flywheel, and this is actually the main timing mark that you use. You can see I recently repainted that pointer white, and I redid a nice white dot for number 1 top dead center. There's also some marks on the timing chain sprocket, so I'll try to show you those when we get there. Shout out to Opel GT Source for reproducing this really rare dealership tool that helps you verify number 1 top dead center. It just goes here in the front of the head, lines up with those holes. Just like that, perfect. There we go. So when I rotate this around, that little pointer will point right at a nice little divot in the cam sprocket, when we're on number 1 top dead center. And so we can corroborate that with the mark on the flywheel. And what I want to do is I want to add a mark on the crank pulley as well, because there isn't really anything obvious right now, but there are some marks on the timing cover that I can use.
The timing mark on the flywheel is an embedded BB that's there from the factory. I've just put some white paint on it. So if this lines up with the pointer, but you don't see a mark on the cam sprocket, that means we're on number 4 top dead center, which is where we'll want to be to remove the head. This being a 4-stroke engine, we'll need to rotate the crank another full rotation to get to number 1 top dead center.
There it is, it went a little too far. But now I see that mark on the sprocket. I'll back off a little, try to get that as dead on as I can. So now I'm going to add a mark to the crank pulley.
This isn't really necessary since you can't really see these marks when the car is all back together, but I figure it can't hurt. Something else I noticed is there's a little bit of slack in the timing chain. When I move the crank back and forth, the flywheel moves by about 3 teeth before the cam sprocket moves. I did a bit of math and this comes out to about 7.5 degrees. I'm not sure how much this matters or if it's normal, but it might be worth looking at the tensioner, which is the next thing to come out. But first I'll bring it back around to number 4 top dead center. Here you can get a little better look at those grooves that need to line up.
Okay, we are now on number 4 top dead center. So the next thing is to loosen the timing chain tensioner, which is this big old 27mm guy right here. Ah, whew. That was tight.
The idea here is to take it most of the way out, but leave it partially in just to plug the hole. Next I could take the plastic cam button out. This was kind of sketchy because if I had dropped this inside the engine, it would go all the way down to the oil pan, so maybe be a little bit more careful and stuff a rag in here.
Okay, next we have these super fun triple square bolts in the cam sprocket. Let's hope we can get those out without stripping them.
Here's the special tool we'll need for these. It's an 8mm triple square bit.
Nice. Oh, I almost forgot a crucial step here. Put something underneath here so you don't drop these down into the oil pan. Holy crap, that was close. Oh. There we go.
Before removing the cam sprocket, it would be a great idea to zip tie the timing chain to it so it doesn't skip a tooth. Of course I forgot to do this until just after, but luckily it hadn't moved.
So at this point, if we were just doing the head gasket, we could leave the rockers alone and not mess up any of our valve lash adjustments. But since I'm doing valve seals, I'm going to go ahead and loosen all of these. Unfortunately, it means we're going to lose our valve lash adjustment, and I'm going to have to learn how to do that. So that'll be fun. But what that'll do is that'll basically make all the valves closed so that when we take it and set it down flat on a surface, it's not going to bump any of the valves and damage anything. So worth keeping in mind, if you are leaving those alone, you'll want to just put it on its side when it's off the car and not put it down where valves could get bashed. So I'll go ahead and loosen these and then we can pull the head off.
With the rockers all loose, meaning the valves are all closed, I can now move on and actually loosen the head bolts. These also use a triple square bit, 12mm this time. And there is a sequence to taking out the head bolts, so I'll just go around with a breaker bar in order to crack them all loose before using an electric tool to remove them all the way.
Is it loose already? It is. Holy crap. Well, that's just ready to come off. All right, I'm gonna change camera angles now. Okay, here goes something. I got a couple layers of towels. I got a table right here. So, should be good. Let's see how this goes. Yeah, it's pretty heavy. Yep. Just like I planned it. Perfect. Ha. Okay. Wow, what do we got going on here? Okay, well, here's what we got. Quite a bit of carbon on the pistons. I'll have to figure out a way to clean these. A little chunk right here. Seems to come off though. A little oily. And stains from the water passages. That's normal, I think. There was a bunch of gunk here. I already scooped some of it off, but I think that was all in the water passageways. Gross. Can definitely tell the cork blew out in the front. That's the problem area on these gaskets. Looks like that was probably leaking in this corner area. Front looks okay until we get there. That was definitely leaking, that corner. Already knew that. But when we put the new one on, we'll want to put a thin layer of RTV over the whole timing cover area and a little bit more of a bead where it meets the block, which doesn't look like it was done on this one, so I think that'll probably help us out. I want to do some more extensive cleaning before I put it back together, but I think we're looking okay. Can still see some pretty nice cross-hatching. Sure. Looks pretty good.
And here's what the underside of the head and the combustion chambers look like. Definitely a lot of fouling, carbon, and oil. I'm not really sure what it's supposed to look like, but this is what it looks like after many years of valve seals leaking. I made a quick attempt at cleaning it up before bringing it inside, but I'm gonna have to go further into this later. After doing a bit of cleaning to the block off camera, I just started dousing it in WD-40, just because I know it's going to take me a while to work on the head, and I don't want this stuff to get rusty in the meantime. So I'm going to totally soak it down and cover it up with plastic. With the head brought inside on a nice clean workbench, we can keep taking it apart. It's a good idea to keep all the moving parts organized so they can go back in the same place where they came from, because these things tend to wear in a slightly unique way, and because the tolerances in an engine are pretty fine, it's just a good idea to put them back where they came from. For this project, I don't actually need to remove the lifters or the cam, but since I'm in here for the first time, I want to find out what I have. It's pretty easy to find out how much lift your cam has, just by measuring the difference between the lowest point and the highest point of one of the lifters as you rotate the cam by hand. It turns out I have a totally original stock camshaft, and that's actually fine. From what I've heard, it's the most drivable, it gives you good response down low, whereas most of the upgraded cams out there are more optimized for high RPM race car stuff, which realistically I'm not doing. Anyway, I'm having a look at the lifters here and learning that I have solid lifters, meaning it's just all one solid piece of metal. This car being a 73 should have come with hydraulic lifters, which would have a little hole in the side and the top part would move separately as it's cushioned by oil. So this is just another clue that this head came from an earlier car. Anyway, now it's time to separate the valve springs, so I rented this spring compressor from the auto parts store and immediately realized it wasn't going to work. So I went back and bought this type of spring compressor, which should work for my purposes. It's really just a lever that you put on one of the rocker studs, tighten down one of the nuts, and use it as a fulcrum to push the spring down while you remove the keepers. The problem is I don't have enough arms to hold the head down while I'm pulling up on this lever. So I'm going to have to figure something out here. So if I flip the head around the other way and use a couple of woodworking clamps to hold it down to the workbench. That frees up my hands to do what I need. But then I quickly realized that when you push down on the spring, it moves everything. So I need to stuff something underneath to hold the valve closed so I can push the spring down on the valve stem and remove the keepers. Then I could gently take the pressure off the spring and it all comes off easily. It's also a good idea to keep track of the valve springs and retainers because they are a little bit different for the intake and exhaust valves. Anyway, here's our first clue that things were done incorrectly in the past. Look at where this seal is all the way down on the valve stem. That's not where it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be in this groove on the stem. Not only that, but it's the wrong type of O-ring, as I'll go into more detail later. I had ordered a set of new valve seals, but they were for a later head, and as you can see, this is a completely different style of seal. The later heads would have a raised portion around the intake valve guide that this seal would fit over, but for me, I'm going to have to order some early valve seals. After pulling those first two valves out, I'm just going to continue taking things apart and moving my padding underneath to hold each set of valves closed while I compress the springs and finish disassembly. And here it is, taken apart as far as it needs to be for what we're doing. Let's take a look at these valves. I guess this is what leaking valve seals will get you after many years. Pretty gross. Another interesting discovery is that all the intake valves are replacements, branded ATE, whereas the exhaust valves still have an Opel marking on them. Also, the double square grooves means these are early valves. If these were later valves, the intake would just have a single round groove for the keeper, and the exhaust valve would have two round grooves for a round O-ring and that late style keeper. Anyway, let's try to clean these valves up. I started off by chucking them in a drill and kind of doing it by hand, which sort of worked, but it was a bit slow. So I broke out the big wire wheel, and that worked a lot better. All the intake valves cleaned up beautifully, and so did the exhaust valves, but they do all have a bit of pitting on the valve seat area. So I am going to try to lap these valves or smooth out those imperfections a little bit, which we'll see later. Next, I wanted to do some more thorough cleaning of the head surface and combustion chambers and valve seats, so out came the wire wheels again. There was still some stubborn, crusty carbon in some areas, so a little bit of digging with a pick got it out. Now let's install our first new part. This is a little upgrade that raises the oil level in the head, making sure the camshaft gets a nice bath. This just fits into the drain back hole at the back of the head. It's a press fit, and it just raises the level by that much. I'm not sure how a professional would install this, but a random C-clamp I had laying around was the perfect tool to press this in. I probably should have used a block of wood on the bottom to make sure I don't mar the surface of the head, but I think I got away with it. And here you can see about how much it's going to raise the oil level and help lubricate the cam. Anyway, let's start putting things back together. Here I'm just making sure the valve guides are clear of any debris. And the next thing I'm going to do is actually grind the valves into the valve seats, which is also known as lapping. So I got some compound and these cheap tools from the auto parts store, basically just suction cups on a stick. I have the head supported on a couple blocks of wood so there's space underneath it. But all we're going to do is put some compound on each valve, put it in, preferably with a light film of oil on the stem so it's not metal on metal, and grip it with the suction cup and rotate it back and forth a whole bunch. Let the abrasive do its work. Just take your time, you'll hear the sound change and eventually it'll feel smooth. And then you can take it back out and make sure to carefully clean up all the abrasive, because the last thing you want is gritty abrasive stuff in your engine. And then I'll just do the same thing on all the rest of them. And at this point, it's even more important to keep track of which valve goes in which hole, because we've basically custom matched each one to its particular seat. Once you're done grinding, you should see a nice smooth gray line on every valve and valve seat. That's good, it shows you where you've been. Once they're all done, more cleaning is in order, just to make sure every last speck of abrasive is gone. The pitting in the exhaust valves was too deep to get out, but I'm just going to run them for now. The intake valves and the valve seats all turned out really nice. Keep in mind I'm just a do-it-yourselfer trying to do the best I can at home without taking this thing to a machine shop, so overall I'm pretty satisfied with how it's going so far. Anyway, now that everything's spotlessly clean, I can go ahead and put all the valves in, again with a little oil on the stems. In hindsight, it would have made life easier if I had temporarily taped these down so that when I flip the head back over, they don't want to fall out. And now I finally get to show you what the correct valve seals look like for these valves. Square-edged O-rings to fit in the square-edged grooves. The only problem is I'm doing this in the wrong order here. I shouldn't be putting these on yet, which I'll figure out in a second. Meanwhile, I put all the lifters back in order, making sure each one had a nice bath of oil. Then as I started putting things back together, I made another discovery of something that wasn't right. Notice how far down this keeper is going before it notches in? I never noticed it before, but this isn't right. And this is what it does to the seal if it goes down too far. Notice how the neighboring valve stem has a lot less showing? It turns out I have two different kinds of valve keepers, when they should all be the same. Whoever rebuilt this head last must have been mixing and matching parts, because all the valves are early style, but half of the keepers are the late style, and here's what happens when you try to use late keepers on early valves. Using the correct ones, of course, gives you the proper clearance. Luckily, a phone call to Opel GT Source netted me some nice used early keepers. Finally, now that I have all the correct parts in hand, I can show you the order of operations to do this without ruining the seal. So if you pretend the valve spring is in place already, this retainer goes on over the top, you compress the spring, and then you can work the seal into the notch on the valve stem. Then you can put the keepers in place and let the pressure off the spring, and that will nicely sandwich everything in place. Let's do it for real. It's probably worth mentioning that these rocker nuts are locking nuts designed to stay tight, and it's what you use to adjust the valve lash. So it's not ideal to be putting them on and taking them off a bunch of times because they eat into the threads of the rocker studs. I'm not sure what else to do at this point though, as I need them to do this job, but maybe down the line I can replace the studs if I need to. In any case, I just carried on with the same technique and got all the valve springs reassembled. With all the springs on, I could go ahead and reinstall the rockers, just loose for now, as I'll need to adjust everything once it's back on the car. Speaking of the car, I still have a bunch of cleaning to do. I managed to rotate the engine over with the timing chain still zip tied to the sprocket to get these two center pistons up so I could wire wheel them off. And eventually I got the whole top side of the engine looking nice and clean. Also, with those pistons clean, I could see these markings which indicate that they are 0.5 millimeter oversized, meaning this engine has been bored out at some point. Cool. Anyway, that's enough messing around. Let's get this head back on the car. A nice little bath and some brake clean will get rid of any oily residue. Then use any kind of compressed air to blow out the crevices and especially the bolt holes. You don't want any fluid in those head bolt holes. I'm just using this electric tire inflator, which gets the job done. Here's the old head bolts all cleaned up, they should be good to go. And here's the new head gasket. It also comes with a brand new rubber O-ring that goes in that water passage. As you can see, this is a 12 bolt style head gasket, unlike the old one, so this should match up properly to my 12 bolt style timing cover. As we saw on the old one, this cork area is kind of the most prone to leak area, so we'll want to put a thin layer of RTV on top of the timing cover, with a little extra on the seam where the timing cover meets the block. Now we can lay down the new head gasket, making sure everything's lined up. And now I can install this magical O-ring. One last time, I want to make sure the head surface is nice and clean, so out comes the brake clean again. Now I'm going to lay it down flat on a piece of clean cardboard so I can put the head bolts in now. Having the bolts hanging down from their holes is actually going to help line up the head with the engine. Now it's the moment of truth. I'm going to put the head back on the same way I took it off. Just as a reminder, the engine should be back on number 4 top dead center, and the cam should be in that position as well. It can be a bit tricky to work your hand around the timing chain, so take your time here, and try not to smash any hoses like I did here. I wiggled it around a bit just to make sure everything feels like it's lined up. Then I started threading in the head bolts. I'm only using this power tool to get them barely in contact, and then there's a whole torquing sequence where you go in a specific order, and there's 4 different rounds where you slowly work your way up in torque until you get to the final setting of 72 foot-pounds. Now with the head officially back on, I could slide the cam gear back on, assuming that the cam itself is lined up, and it is. I got some new bolts for the cam gear, but it turns out these aren't going to work. The heads are too big for the plastic cam button to go in, so I'll be changing them again soon. But for now, since it's attached, I can go ahead and cut the zip ties on the timing chain, and use my fancy little tool again just to double check that the timing marks line up for number 1. And we're good, so let's move on. The next thing I did was to put the rear cam cover back on with a new gasket. Then I got some different new screws for the cam sprocket, and this time with the proper cap head that should actually fit. These are just a hex, so I put some blue Loctite on them to make sure they're not going to come loose, and use some electrical tape around my hex bit just to make sure it doesn't fall down into the engine. Also put a cloth down there. Now the plastic cam button fits in between those bolts perfectly, but here's where I ran into one more weird idiosyncrasy of the early versus late head differences. This plastic button is supposed to be just barely touching or really close to this front cover plate so the cam doesn't walk back and forth too much, but this gap is huge. I was a bit confused because the white button is correct for the early head that I have, but previously this orange taller one was in there, which is for a late head. What I figured out happened is somebody modified the front cover plate in order to use the late button. Maybe that's all that was available at the time. So I started to put it back together in this configuration, but I couldn't get the clearance right and I kind of messed up the threads on the plastic button, so I just decided to call up Opel GT Source, and they did come through with a nice used front cover plate that hasn't been modified. This piece is actually the same on early and late heads. It's the head itself that has thicker metal on the late head. While it is kind of annoying to have to wait longer and buy more parts, I do feel better having all the correct stuff that hasn't been bodged. With all that in place, I could go ahead and set the gap to 6/1000ths of an inch. So if you remember early in the video when I noticed some slack in the timing chain, it turns out this is a pretty common thing and the Germans have come up with a solution. This is a longer version of the hydraulic timing chain tensioner, and I'm just going to install it, and it's going to push a little bit harder on the guide for the timing chain. Let me know in the comments if you think this is a good idea or not. I know it might wear out the guide a little bit faster because it's a plastic guide that rubs against the timing chain. It might be a little noisier as well, but hopefully it should give me more accurate timing. And I don't know if you can tell, but I tried to get both timing marks in the shot so you can see there's basically no slack anymore, so it definitely works.
Okay, well I guess it's as good a time as any to adjust the valve lash. I've got a wrench on the crank pulley so I can rotate the engine. I've got all the spark plugs out so it rotates freely. And I've got a little cheat sheet straight out of the workshop manual to know that when one valve is fully open, that means that a corresponding valve is on the base circle of the cam, meaning I can set the tolerance. I have this little feeler gauge which is set to 12/1000ths of an inch, which is the spec for these. Now, because this car has solid lifters, they actually need to be set when the engine is hot at operating temperature. Obviously I can't do that right now, but what I can do is set them to spec cold, and then once I have the car running again, I can recheck them and adjust them the same way. So let's get going.
So I'm just going to rotate the engine until I see one of these lifters coming up, and I'll use that as my starting point, refer back to my chart, and start there. It looks like number 4 is coming up, which means I'll adjust number 5.
Okay, so I'll just start tightening this nut.
So with the feeler gauge in between the rocker arm and the valve stem, what we're looking for is you can still slide the feeler gauge in and out, but it's a tight fit.
Yeah, it's actually tight now, but I think that's pretty good. And when this is in, you shouldn't be able to jiggle it, which I can't, so I think that's good. So now we just repeat the same thing on the rest of them. Now I can cross this one off my list so I remember that I did it, and just move on to the next one. Looks like number 7 wants to be next. Right there. And the base circle is much bigger than the point. So there's a little bit of leeway there. So checking my list again. Number 7 fully open means adjust number 2.
Now, of course, I'll just repeat the process for all the rest of the valves. When that was all done, I gave the engine a nice turn over by hand just to watch all the valves going up and down and make sure it all looks good, which it does. Now this probably won't be surprising, but I couldn't just leave the engine looking all ugly, so much cleaning and scrubbing and scuffing and degreasing commenced. I even took the starter off to get more access. Then out came the masking tape so I could get ready to coat the engine with some VHT black engine enamel. Once that was done and looking much better, I could carry on putting things back together. Here goes the thermostat housing with a brand new gasket. I poured some fresh oil on these moving parts just to make sure they're well lubricated the first time I start up, and to potentially wash down any debris that could have gotten in here during the whole process down into the oil pan before changing the oil. With the fresh oil change done, I can move on to reinstalling everything else, including the radiator and the exhaust and intake manifolds. Once all the hoses were hooked up, I could fill the radiator and then hook up all the electrical connections, and I think I'm ready to fire this thing up.
Well, I almost can't believe it, but I think it's actually time to start this up again. We've got everything reassembled, put back together, fresh fluids in, regasketed things that needed regasketing. Should be good. As far as the timing, that shouldn't have changed since it was last running because I never moved the distributor. The only thing that might have changed a little bit is that new tensioner that I put in could actually affect it by a couple degrees, but probably not enough to matter. Once I get it going, which might take some cranking because there's no fuel in the carburetor, the coolant will probably start circulating, which means I'll need to top it off. So I'll do that, cap it off, and then let the whole thing run for a bit, get up to temperature, as long as there's no horrible clattering noises. Then once it's up to temperature, shut it down, pull the valve cover off, and double check all the valve lash adjustments while it's hot. And then after that, should be good to go. Meanwhile, can you keep an eye on it over there and let me know if anything's leaking? All right, thanks. There's probably gonna be a puff of smoke out the back just because of whatever oil and crap got in there during this whole process. Anyway, I'll probably have to crank it for a little bit for fuel to get up there. I don't hear any bad noises. Hey. Oh, it sounds good. It's on the fast idle. There's a little bit of clattering I can hear. Just a little bit. But not bad, not bad. Well, she's chugging along pretty well. There's definitely a little bit of Valvetrain noise, so it's going to be good to finalize the valve lash setting. But I'm just going to continue letting this warm up and kind of watching for leaks. It's a little bit smoky at first, but I think that's some oil and paint burning off. for now I just want to get this run in. The good news is it's idling nicely, so I'm just going to let it keep warming up and hopefully do that hot valve adjustment. Okay.
At this point, I pulled the spark plugs out to make the engine easy to turn over and just went through the whole valve adjustment procedure again, going down my list. Most of them were still within spec, but I did have to adjust a couple. This won't be the last time I do this. I'm sure after I drive it for a little while, I'll want to check it again. But for now, I'm ready to button this back up and go for my first drive. Okay, first little test drive / joyride. Oh, it's so good to drive this again. Oh man, it actually sounds good. It sounds smooth. It's not clattering any more than it used to, so that's good. Oh, this is great. Oh, I missed it.
There's definitely some smells happening, but I did put fresh paint on the block. I put fresh paint on the exhaust manifold. I dripped oil on things. So I'm not surprised there's some smells happening. I'm definitely a little bit cautious. This is my second drive, so I'm a little bit less worried. The first drive went fine and hasn't leaked a drop of oil yet. I haven't seen anything seeping out around the head gasket. I haven't really seen any smoke out the exhaust, so fingers crossed. I think I might have actually pulled this off. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I'm not a mechanic. So the fact that I could do this level of deep engine surgery, discover previous mistakes that actual mechanics made, and put everything back together and have it run perfectly with no leaks, no clattering, other than the normal amount of clattering, it's pretty gratifying. Well, it's a couple weeks later. I've been driving this around a bunch just to make sure it's all good, and yeah, still no leaks. The engine bay is still clean, which is a new concept for me. It doesn't smoke at startup. Sounds good. So I think I actually pulled this off. I don't know why I'm surprised, but you know, this is why it pays to work on your own car, because you learn a lot. I discovered what's inside there, what kind of cam I have, what the valves are, and all those little details. I learned some new nuances to look out for next time. And I caught some mistakes that previous professionals made. So I will say, all said and done, this took me about 2 months to do this project. I'm sure it looked really easy on camera, but yeah, it took a while, but the end result is great. And now I can drive and enjoy the car and move on to some more fun projects that are coming soon. So, hope you enjoyed this, got some inspiration from it to work on your own car. And the Opel will be back, and I got some Miata stuff coming as well. So stay tuned to the channel, and I'll see you next time. I'm gonna look at this view though for a bit. This is great. Yep. It's a little outside, but never mind. This was simple. I just had to, you know, kind of climb in here. Oh, I almost forgot to loosen the freaking rockers. Shoot. Where did I put the tool? I don't know. Over here. No, it's a little one. Well, thought I was better prepared. What happened? I don't know. Was that the one? Crying out loud. Why did I start recording? There's enough room for me to fully get a leg in and kind of straddle the fender, because I don't think I can get both feet in. Or can I? Well, sure. I can't believe how much room is in here. Wow. I don't know if it's going to give me enough time to do anything. How am I supposed to do that? Guess I can kind of feel it. Yeah, it's splattering. Yeah, I don't think that's gonna work. What a mess that made already. Holy crap. Okay, so I'm just gonna do it with the engine not running. There's a car coming, so I'm going to wait. Oh, it's awkward. I hate when people see me filming. I don't know why. I'm just very self-conscious. So why do I do videos? I don't know. Seems fun. It's a nice day though.